Good evening, everyone. Firstly, apologies for the slight delay that happened. We had some technical issues that we dealt with, but we're through with it right now. Quickly to introduce myself, I manage the partnerships and strategic alliances for the Indian School of Public Policy. And really interesting to see, glad to see a lot of attendees already we have and who have kind of attended before the scheduled time. Which is really encouraging. Thank you so much for joining. So quickly to introduce and welcome the guest speaker we have today, Professor Bhaskar Chakravorti, and to give a quick background. He's the Dean of Global School at the Fletcher School, Global Business at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and the founding Executive Director of Fletcher's Institute for Business in the Global Context. Professor, we would like to thank you for joining us today and for your time. I hope all the attendees, will enjoy listening to you. And the topic for today, as you all know, is digital India is lovely, but can it get past the real India? So it's a very interesting one. I'm excited. And quickly before handing over the session to the to the speaker, just a quick information. Any questions you have, I request you to keep posting it in the chat box, and during the Q&A session the speaker will answer. We will read out the questions and then speaker will answer. So under the chat box, right? So under the chat box you may drop in your questions. So without any due delay, I would like to hand over the session to Professor Chakraborty. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ram, and thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your day to spend just a little bit of time reflecting on something that I'm sure is an integral part of your day-to-day life, which is you are all native to the digital planet. You have grown up in kind of digitally saturated circumstances, and perhaps nowhere in the world is this level of saturation as meaningful and profound as it is in India. I think looking at the developments that have been happening across the world on the digital front, and then honing in on India specifically and trying to understand the changes that have been going on across the landscape in India are just fascinating to even try and understand why India has become perhaps the hottest destination for digital activity, digital investment, digital entrepreneurship. And this is true not only for people who have been focusing on India for a while, but it is true for entrepreneurs and investors across the world. I spend a lot of time working with people in this space in Silicon Valley, in Boston, in China, and in Europe, and across the board. Digital India is something that has been, quite a focus of people's attention. And as you also are well aware, India is, after China, now the largest digital market, and certainly soon to be, one of the most exciting places to be in from that perspective. So what I thought I would do is spend a little bit of time kind of reflecting on where we are in that journey from a physical past to a digital future, and specifically also trying to understand the notion that digital India is obviously something that is growing very, very fast, but can it get past the real India? And so that's something that I would love to kind of have a conversation with all of you about. Now, the digital ecosystem, as we all know, is something that has been, continuing to grow, in leaps and bounds over the last, certainly over the last 30 years. And as this system of technologies and applications layered on top of technologies continues to expand, there is a growing need for us to try and better understand how different countries and different parts of the world are evolving from a physical past to a digital future. So what we did at the Fletcher School is about 8 years back, we launched a major initiative called the Digital Planet. And the idea of the Digital Planet is to map the journey from physical to digital by capturing data across over 250 variables that affect a number of different elements of the digital ecosystem. We looked at supply, demand, institution elements, and innovation elements. On the supply side, we tried to understand what is happening on the front of digital infrastructure, the spread of computers and mobile phones, connectivity issues, and so on and so forth. We looked at issues on the demand side in terms of what affects consumer adoption, what kinds of form factors and devices do they have to access the digital ecosystem. On the institutional front, we looked at laws and regulations and government involvement and government subsidies and promotion of digital services. And finally, on the innovation front, we looked at how the entire venture system and the entrepreneurial ecosystem is developing as it tries to be a catalyst for growth of the digital industry. Now, we took all of that information and recognized that this is an enormously complex set of changes that are happening in countries across the world. We collected data from over 80 countries, of course, India being one of them. And we took this enormously complicated reality and reduced it to actually something ridiculously simple in the form of an index. And the index is a way to take something very complicated and make it, boil it down to one number in order to facilitate an apples to apples comparison between very, very different and complicated circumstances and complicated societies. And the idea is not to simplify complexity, but the idea is first to simplify in order to facilitate that comparison and then ask questions about why a country is where it is, why somebody is moving much faster than you are, and so on and so forth. And then having asked those questions, open up the box of complexity, as it were, and try and get behind that simple number and be able to interrogate the patterns and look for the drivers and try to find explanations for why things are the way they are and what can be done in order to make a difference. Now, what I have in front of you is I'm going to try and give you a snapshot of what this picture of digital evolution across 60 countries is looking like. And this is based on our last digital evolution index, which came out 2 years back, and our next one is going to be coming out in the next 6 months. And what I have is two axes. On the horizontal axis, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I believe the slides are not getting displayed on the screen.
Oh, okay. Can you see them now?
Now we can.
Yes, we can see that.
Thank you.
Okay. So what you have is two axes. There is a vertical axis, which if you go from south to north, that will represent a higher degree of evolution, as in the country has made greater progress as you go from the bottom to the top of that map, greater progress in its journey from a physical past to a digital future. And if you go on the horizontal axis from left to right, then that shows the momentum or the pace of change. Okay, so south to north is state of evolution, left to right, or east to west to east is the momentum or rate of change. Okay, and now I'm going to put all 60 countries on that map, and now you can see where different countries across the world, how they stack up against each other in terms of their degree of digital evolution. Now, there's a lot of information in here, and let me try and kind of break that down a little bit by doing some initial clustering. So on the top right-hand side of this chart, is a set of countries that I will call the standout countries. So these are countries that are doing extremely well, both in state and in rate. So they are highly evolved, but they're also moving very quickly. And examples of countries that are in the space are countries like Singapore and New Zealand and the United Arab Emirates and Estonia and Israel, United Kingdom, and so on. Then on the top left-hand side are countries that I would call the stall-out countries, and these are countries that are highly digitally evolved. They're digitally mature, and along with digital maturity comes a degree of digital arthritis. So they have actually slowed down. And so the momentum is slower than countries in other parts of this chart. And the predominant set of countries here are the Western European countries. And then on the bottom left are countries that I call the watch out countries. These are the ones that are weak in terms of state and weak in terms of rate. And then finally, the bottom right are the countries that are truly the most dynamic, the most exciting segment of the mall, which I call the breakout countries. And these are the ones that have not yet achieved their digital potential, but they are moving very, very quickly. And you can see a number of the emerging markets sort of clustered right here, a big concentration of countries out of Asia, and a big concentration of countries out of Latin America and some from sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see India right there. And you can also see how India stacks up against many of the countries that quite often we compare ourselves to. Now, a few things to note about what is on this page. The country with the highest momentum, the highest rate of change on the extreme right-hand side is China. But it's also quite interesting to note that there are several countries that are experiencing similar rates of digital momentum close to China, such as Malaysia and Bolivia and Kenya and Russia, Colombia. India still has some distance to go. A few other observations. If you look at the countries that are in the standout zone, the ones that are kind of the rock stars in the digital planet, there are countries like Singapore and New Zealand and UAE and Estonia, Israel. What do you find common across these countries? The two things that you'll see that's common. Thing number one is that they're small. Thing number two is that the government in these countries plays an enormously important role in promoting infrastructure, in promoting, in particular, digital infrastructure. So the role of public policy in advancing the digital rock stars is something that stands out to me in this chart. Speaking of government, look at some of the countries that are on the right-hand side of this chart in the breakout zone. If you look at countries like China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Turkey, what's common there? Well, what's common is most of these countries have had a very strong, in many cases, autocratic or single-party governments in power. So the fact that the government plays a very important role in a country has a very significant contribution to its digital momentum. I'll make one more point about this chart because there's a lot to talk about here, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. But one more point is if you look at the bottom right of this chart, as I mentioned, that is where a lot of the energy and dynamism is. And put some numbers down against each of the dots on the bottom right in terms of the population. Once you stack up population numbers, you'll realize that not only are these countries ones with high digital momentum, they're also countries with lots of potential users. In other words, there is momentum and mass that is concentrated in the bottom right-hand side of this chart. So the digital population of the world is heavily concentrated on the bottom right of this chart. And this is a very interesting, important pattern if you are an investor, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're looking for opportunities anywhere in the world. So now let me advance this to I'm going to spend a little bit of time on a few different facets of the digital planet. And so now let me touch on a topic that is perhaps top of mind for many of us who are now kind of going through a period of reckoning with this digital saturation that we've been experiencing over the last several years, which is we are obviously enjoying the enormous benefits of the digital planet, but at the same time, we are beginning to ask questions about whether how much trust do we place and how much trust should we place in what goes on behind the screens that we are potentially so tied to and so addicted to. There's a lot of questioning of the role of the digital providers, whether it is the large platforms like Facebook and Twitter or WhatsApp, or companies like Amazon, Google, and Apple in mediating our digital conversations, our digital transactions, and capturing the traces of our digital activities, and then translating that data into products that they can then monetize. So most users are doing this without a whole lot of knowledge in terms of what happens once their data is captured on the servers of these companies. So this turns into a question of trust. When you go from the physical world to the digital world, there are several things, obviously, that change. For instance, if I were to buy something from you in the physical world, I can go to a sabzi mandi and I want to buy some vegetables. I stand, right next to a vegetable seller. I can look him in the eye. I can look at the vegetables. I can feel the vegetables. I can see if the vegetables are fresh or not. And then I put it in a bag. I pay him some money, and I leave. Now, in the digital world, if I were to try to do the same thing, I don't have the opportunity to look the seller in the eye. I don't have the opportunity to feel and palpate the vegetables as I would in the physical world. So we have all kinds of proxies, and the notion of trust becomes an enormously important factor in easing the way of any kind of a digital interaction. And it is enormously important to try and understand the extent to which people trust the digital systems, the extent to which they trust the content that comes across the digital systems, the extent to which there is friction in that digital interaction, which people are willing to tolerate. So what we did was we actually created several measures of digital trust. And then we tried to understand how do all those countries that we studied, how do they stack up in terms of the level of trust that users show in those countries about the digital ecosystems? And we find that there are some very interesting patterns that pop out there as well. So the breakout countries, it turns out that there is something that we call a trust surplus. And what that means is that these are countries where the digital ecosystems, the digital infrastructure, the digital laws and regulations are perhaps not as trustworthy as one would expect from a global standard. However, the users in these countries tend to trust the digital system disproportionately more, which is a bit of a paradox. Users tend to trust the digital system more, even though the digital system is less than trustworthy in terms of a global average. And then when you go to the other corner, it's exactly the opposite. Users in these parts of the world tend to have somewhat more trustworthy digital ecosystems and digital infrastructure. And users in this part of the world are, on average, less trusting of the digital system. So again, we can go deeper and try and understand what's going on. Why is this inherent paradox showing up in different parts of the world? So I'll just leave you with one hypothesis in terms of what might be going on. So if you look at people here, we have users who are beginning to come online relatively in the kind of they're relatively new in terms of their access to digital infrastructure. For many of them, this is perhaps the first time that they are getting access to this enormous wealth of information and all the conveniences that digital systems offer. So for them, the alternatives are so much less attractive than what you see on your mobile phone. So you tend to trust this new novel element a whole lot more than users who are up here who have had time to mature with these systems and now are beginning to put the information that they get on their screens in a larger context, and they begin to interrogate every piece of news that they get on social media or not. So this is not to say that people do not have the same issues in the developed world as you would see in the developing world. It's just a question of degree. So the degree of trust in the developed world in the stall out zone is significantly lower. Now let me touch on a different issue, and that has to do with how do the countries that are behind in terms of digital evolution and digital momentum, how do they catch up with the countries that are ahead? And this is a question that I get asked all the time, every time I talk about this work. So quite often I've been asked about India and how can India catch up with where China is or where many of the Southeast Asian countries are. So we've actually been able to break down some of the core drivers that might need to change if one needs to facilitate a catch-up process for India. And I've identified some of the drivers here, such as digital access availability, use of digital money, closing the mobile internet gap, including more women into the digital system. India has one of the lowest participation rates for women with access to the internet. Changes in the physical infrastructure, and so on. And I've also identified the extent to which each of these drivers contributes to digital momentum as far as playing catch up is concerned. And we can actually calculate how much time it would take for India to close the gap between where it is today and get to where China is today, or where Malaysia is today, or where Singapore is today. So if India were to adopt the current rate of growth of China in terms of digital momentum, it could reach China's digital state by 2029, Malaysia by 2038, and Singapore by 2054. We've also identified some scenarios that policymakers could look at in order to check out how much, what it would need to change in order to get to China's current digital state in, say, a 5-year time frame. India needs to change its annual growth in gender digital inclusion by 18%. It needs to grow its physical infrastructure by 3%. It needs to grow its annual R&D investments by 3%, digital access availability by 1%. So it's just one scenario that is a helpful set of benchmarks for policymakers. Now, speaking of benchmarks, let me show you a final section on benchmarks and setting digital policy by looking at global benchmarks. So one of the things we wanted to do was try and understand how can we help India's policymakers figure out how to use digital technology to provide public services. So we created a global benchmark for that, and we asked the question, what constitutes a smart society, as in a society where governments utilize the best available digital technologies and data to provide the services that governments are supposed to provide, such as robust economies, facilitate the well-being of its people, and strong institutions. So what I have here is a framework for policymakers to identify their goals. We created a way to set up a global benchmark. This outer edge of this graphic is a benchmark that we have created using the digitally 5 most advanced governments in the world, and this is a set of governments called the Digital 5, the D5. It includes countries such as Estonia, Israel, New Zealand, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. And now I can place any country inside that graph, and the footprint of that country shows how much it has advanced towards that benchmark. So these are each of the 5 countries on that map. And now I will show you where India stands. So this was India in around just before the previous elections. And the global benchmark is the outer edge. The squiggly, the orange line in the middle is where India was before the previous elections. The brown line somewhere in between is actually a second benchmark that we created using a set of 5 emerging market countries to offer a comparison point that is a little bit closer to India. And this is how India has changed since the previous election till a few years, just a couple of years back. So India has improved on a number of different fronts. It has improved in the areas of developing its talent base, improved in the areas of entrepreneurship and innovation, improved in areas of trust in institutions. It's improved in the areas of public services, in environment and quality of life and inclusivity. It has actually declined in areas of freedoms and economic robustness. So let me just kind of pause here. There are, of course, a lot of issues to sort of cover, but what I thought I would do is show you a few different pieces of analyses for the digital planet as it stands, and the fact that the digital planet is not standing still, it's continuing to evolve, and where India stands in that larger landscape, and particularly how digital technology is a key facilitator for public policy around the world and certainly in India. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. So we do have some questions in the chat box. So let me just read out the first question. Am I audible, Professor?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, sure. The first question we have is, genuine, authentic data collection is scarce in India. Kindly reflect on the incentives that can be generated on regulating the same.
So if you could just repeat the question, the genuine, authentic data collection is what?
Scarce in India.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I get it. I think you're absolutely right. I think it is challenging to get robust data. And so we recognize those challenges, and those challenges exist not just in India, but across the developing world. We spend a lot of time triangulating all the data that we get, double checking the sources, and also finding multiple sources to verify the sources of data. And quite often there are gaps in data, and a big part of doing global analysis based on evidence is to verify that the evidence is reliable. And so we do a pretty thorough job of verifying both the sources and the robustness of the data. And wherever there are data gaps, we try and close it by doing some intelligent analysis of it. But you're absolutely right. It is challenging to get reliable data. But the good news is that India does have a good tradition of data capture, and a number of bodies, both public sector and independent bodies that are in the process of getting good information across a variety of different parameters. So I would say India, among the developing countries, is probably one of the better places to go for data. It's much harder, say, in a country like Nigeria, where the data is extremely noisy. So relative to countries like Nigeria or Rwanda or Kenya, where we have done work, I find Indian data, somewhat friendlier to the analyst.
Great. So the other question we have is human capital that is enhanced by education and digital evolution for better skills of using technology should go hand in hand. Do we see the relative proportion of each being high in India?
So I'm not sure I completely get the question. Human capital. If you could just repeat the question, Ram.
Yeah. Human capital. I mean, is referring to enhanced by education. That is enhanced by education.
Absolutely.
And digital evolution, which is for better skills of using technology, should go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. So, do we see the relative proportion of each being high in India?
So human capital, I mean, obviously India is, I would say now, the largest store of untapped human capital anywhere in the world. It is, soon to be the youngest country in the world. By youngest, not only, from the perspective of age, but also from the perspective of a reservoir of human capital. This is, the most productive, potentially most productive workforce, anywhere in the world. Now, the big challenge for India is making sure that this reservoir of human capital has the skills and talent to be able to be productive members of a workforce. And while India has made some progress in developing its human capital, it has a very long way to go. In fact, our educational institutions have not at all kept pace with the enormous needs to grow the skills of this workforce, and it has not kept pace with the growth of Indian GDP overall, and it has not kept pace with India's need to increase the productivity of its workforce. So our development of human capital there's still a lot of room to grow. And unfortunately, the investments that have been made in this area are still, quite inadequate. Simultaneously, in terms of digital evolution, it's quite interesting that the penetration of the mobile phone in India has been growing exponentially. In fact, just in the last 2 years, access to the mobile internet has gone up by 200 million people. So the evolution of the digital infrastructure has grown phenomenally in India. And in many ways, that's a good thing, because we want as many people with access to all the conveniences of the digital system, and be able to access not only information and knowledge and communicate with others, but become, potentially utilize the digital growth for resources that they can use to build their skills, to build their businesses, if I'm a farmer, to be able to identify what prices are being offered in different wholesale markets. So all kinds of reasons why the digital evolution is an important facet of growth in the system. However, I think the fact that digital evolution has been happening so fast in India, and the evolution of education of the human capital has not been happening as fast, could potentially be a problem in the following sense. People are getting access to the internet without a whole lot of education to put all that information of the internet into context. And that could create a bit of an explosive situation where I look at a whole bunch of information that comes to me on WhatsApp, and I may not be able to identify whether this is true or not, or I may not be able to figure out how to use a piece of information to increase my own productive capacity. And if I had some more education, if I had some skill building resources at my disposal, then I could have utilized this digital evolution better. So I completely agree with the person who posed the question. The two go hand in hand. Unfortunately, in India, we have one that is moving very, very fast, which is digital evolution. The other one has not been moving that fast, which is education of the workforce or development of that human capital.
Yeah. So the other question we have is, are we going ahead with digital age or stepping back in terms of development?
I'm not sure I would be able to address that question. It seems rather broad. I think we certainly it depends on what one means in terms of going ahead. In India, we're definitely advancing in terms of our engagement with digital technology, both in terms of quantity and complexity. Unclear whether we are uniformly engaging with digital technology in terms of quality or in terms of increased productivity. One could argue that there are many indicators that perhaps productivity, might actually be going in the wrong direction. So yeah, we are advancing in by some measures in terms of the digital age. In terms of development, was that the second half of the question? Are we advancing in terms of development?
Professor, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of development, again, depending on how you measure it, right? So if the top line measure of growth of national output in terms of GDP, yeah, of course we're developing. India is the fastest growing large country in the world. So there's no question about the fact that we're developing. The question to my mind is, are we developing in a way that is inclusive? So are we developing in a way that every a layer of society is participating in that growth? Every layer of the society is participating in access to opportunities in that growth. So to my mind, that is what a true measure of development is. It is not just some top line number which says you've accomplished 7% growth or 8% growth, but how are different segments of society growing? And growing not just by one measure, but growing across a whole bunch of different measures. So as an example, let's look at the difference between growth of access to a variety of resources and the differences that exist between men and women. India has one of the worst records in terms of women's participation in the workforce, one of the worst records in terms of pay gap between men and women, one of the worst records in terms of women's access to the digital infrastructure. So I would say, again, there's a divergence. India is the fastest growing large economy in the world, but in terms of various measures of inclusion, India is actually going backwards. So one example is gender inclusion. Now, one big thing that has changed in just this last few weeks, which is we're all going through a national election right now. A significant change that has happened is this is going to be the first national election in India where there are going to be more women participating in the election than men. And I think that is a notable landmark. So from a public policy standpoint, an important question for policymakers should be, there are going to be more women voting in Indian elections. So let's make sure we change the status of women across India. And when we do that, when we change the status not just of women but other segments of Indian society, that's when I'll say that we are truly making progress towards development.
Oh, that's a very interesting fact you shared. Thank you so much, Professor. So the other question we have is, there are completely different parameters to digitize rural and urban areas. Should there be different approaches for increasing digital adoption?
I think there are, of course, different parameters, and there are different degrees of penetration of the digital infrastructure in rural and urban areas. I think at the foundational level, we should be using uniform measures to study the degree of penetration, regardless of where a user lives. That said, different parts of the country have different needs. So we need to be sensitive to, what are some of the most significant benefits that the digital infrastructure can provide to users in the rural areas, and correspondingly, what are some of the most significant benefits that can be provided to users in urban areas. So users in rural areas, for instance, are more dependent on agriculture. So let's make sure we have some of the key benefits to farmers and those who depend on the agricultural sector provided over the digital infrastructure in villages. And simultaneously, for users in the urban areas, let's identify, what some of the biggest benefits are that could be provided over the digital systems to folks who live in the cities. And a lot of that may have to do with the quality of air, the quality of jobs, or the availability of water and electricity, and many of these things, of course, exist across the country, regardless of whether you're urban or rural. But we need to measure digital evolution uniformly at the foundational level, and then measure the benefits in sort of segmented ways. So we prioritize different benefits depending on where the user lives, to make sure that the limited resources are prioritized and put against the highest and best use.
Okay. So the next question is, will RBI's push for local data be a speed breaker for fintech?
It can be. I think part of the challenge for not just the fintech industry, but every sector of the digital ecosystem in India is that we want to catalyze local entrepreneurs, and at the same time, we want to provide the local entrepreneurs access to resources, and many of those resources come from global sources. And those resources could be capital resources or technological and commercial relationships. The drive towards localization of data, what that does is it potentially freezes a lot of the international interest in the Indian ecosystem, because it raises the costs for the international players. So I think there is, on the one hand, some benefits because it provides a certain amount of a cover for local fintechs to grow. And on the other hand, it could limit the growth because international players find it more difficult to compete and participate in India, and thereby take those local fintechs and put it on a larger platform and make their own networks and markets grow, beyond that initial startup phase. So the bottom line is my suggestion in terms of data and where it should be kept is we should take all the steps to ensure responsible stewardship of data that is captured on servers of companies large and small. We should have a set of firm policies in place to ensure privacy and security of that data, of every user's data. We should make it clear to users about how the data is being used in a simple way and not make it incomprehensible for users. And we should make the data accessible anywhere in the world, because ultimately you cannot persist over the long term by creating protectionist systems. So we need to have our fintechs and every other tech player be globally competitive. Of course, India is a giant market. It's important that our fintechs take root in this very important market, but eventually they will have to compete in a global marketplace.
Yeah, we have a lot more questions actually floating in, but due to paucity of the time, we'll have to consider this as the last question. But as mentioned earlier during the introduction, all the questions will be answered. We will respond over an email, and we'll request Professor whenever he has time to kind of respond to those questions, which will be forwarded, and that will be shared with all the participants. So we'll go to the last. Yeah, thank you so much. So with this, the last question is: India is in the trust surplus quadrant. Will it help in the development process?
I think it's a great question, and a great question to sort of close on. I think the fact that India is in the trust surplus quadrant is the positive side of it is that the users in general are optimistic about the possibilities of the digital ecosystem. And that's a great place to start, because when somebody enthusiastically embraces this new technology and its applications, then you can engage them in a variety of ways. So that I think will help integrate digital technology as a lever for development and a lever for achieving policy objectives, and people will not be suspicious about this new thing that is now becoming a part of our lives. So I think it is a positive force from that perspective. However, it could be a negative force in the sense that if we blindly trust the digital system, then we do not know how to distinguish between useful information and misinformation. We do not know how to quite utilize the enormous wealth of resources that is coming through this digital system in order to translate that into productive use at work and in our day-to-day lives. And if the digital system is used to manipulate people, as unfortunately we have seen in the recent years, then it would be a detractor to development.
Well, with that, I would like to once again thank you so much, Professor, for your time. It was really insightful. Actually, I'm sure the participants would have, they would have enjoyed this answer, elaborative enough for one to kind of understand. So thank you so much. So with that, actually, we are closing this session. But before we close, just for all your information, ISPP, Indian School of Public Policy's third round of deadline is application deadline is on the 20th of May. So you may explore the application, log into the, just go to the website and you will find the link to register and then submit the application. Website address is ispp.org.in, and any questions you have, you can drop in an email to contact@ispp.org.in. So any questions pertaining to this webinar, if you weren't able to kind of post your question here, you may feel free to kind of drop in your question at contact@ispp.org.in. We'll be happy to respond to you. With that, thank you so much. So have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you, Ram, and thank you to all of you who joined. And for any further information on some of this work, feel free to visit the Digital Planet at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Thank you.